need to influence Bob, that's the head of IT, to, help approve something I need, like new software. I'm just using an example, right? But I go to him and I'm like, hey, Bob, I need you to approve this new software because it's really going to help my clients. It's going to make it easier for me to get work done more efficiently. But Bob keeps saying no. Okay. Like, what do I do?
Well, you can imagine, first of all, if Bob keeps saying no, and I am guilty of the fundamental attribution error, I'm saying to myself, man, Bob is a pain in the butt. Bob is stubborn. Bob is myopic. Bob is only worried about IT. Bob is in it for himself. So that's probably how I'm going into the conversation, which we already know isn't helpful.
And no one's ever said that about a guy in IT named Bob, ever, right?
God bless the Bobs of the world.
All right, sorry, Bob.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey, Philpot, and Cade, Cowan. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
So, Stacey, what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about one of my favorite topics, which is influence. And you know the saying, dress for the job you want, not the job you have?
Yeah, of course. It's like, don't wear a hoodie. Wear, can you say blazer anymore? That sounds terribly old-fashioned.
Jacket? Can you wear a jacket?
No, what do the finance pros wear? The vest.
The vest.
No hoodie, but a vest. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when we're talking about leadership, I think we should change the saying so it's more like, do the leadership you want, not the leadership you have. How do you act at a level above where you are?
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, I know what you're talking about there. People who want that next job, and yet they're simply waiting for the title to lead in that way when the opportunity to lead exists at any moment in time. Yeah.
Exactly. It does. And influence is one of those things that you do regardless of your role, regardless of authority. And so it really is the work of leadership. And it's the thing that great leaders do. They are able to influence other people. And so today I think we can break it down a little bit and talk about what we know and what some of the social science says about influencing.
Let's define it first, because I think for a lot of people, the idea of influencing essentially means I'm going to show up at a meeting with Stacey and I'm going to convince her to adopt my way of thinking or my approach on this matter. You've seen that, right?
I have. I think people don't know how to distinguish between influence and persuasion or even coercion. I think that people, and I particularly know this with my female clients, they kind of recoil at the ideas of being more influential because they think of it as manipulation or coercion or, pushing someone to be something or do something that they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm. So how at, let's say, its most basic form, would you begin to think about the various distinctions of influencing?
Right. Well, if you think of it as, coercion or persuasion in a lighter way is about, I'm right, here's the logic, here's what we should do. Influence, that's kind of like a push style. Like,
yeah, you're pushing your agenda.
Exactly. And that has a place, right? There are times when if someone's pushing you to do something, if they have good intentions, it's not so bad, is it?
Right. Well, if you'll remember, working with executive teams during COVID, there was quite a bit of pushing because it was so chaotic and organizations needed some like anchor or stake in the ground. And so pushing was actually pretty appropriate then, but that kind of has a short shelf life, we know.
Totally. That's a great point because, in times of crisis, being more directive, more declarative, that works. But in a non-crisis situation, that doesn't feel good for people. And instead of a push style, you need more of a pull style, because with a push style, what you're really getting is compliance. You're not actually getting someone's commitment to what you want to do. You're not really influencing them. You're just kind of using your power over them. I have the title and you've got to do what I say. And that's not really leadership if you think about it.
You know what? I've heard a couple of people say that, leadership is what happens in the room when your body is no longer in it. The idea of, does my leadership last after my physical presence is gone? And with compliance, we know that it does not last, right? People may do what you want them to do as long as you're watching, but when you're gone or time has passed, that compliance slips.
It really does. And that's exhausting as a leader. If you're having to follow up after everyone and run after them to get them to comply with what you've asked, you find out pretty quickly you're going to run out of steam, right? Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what does pulling look like? Because pulling is more like it's bridging, it's asking questions, it's disclosing sometimes when you feel uncertain or being a little bit vulnerable selectively. It's saying, let's solve this together and finding some common ground, right? But what's really important is in a pull style of leadership where you're trying to influence someone, you cannot do it without one thing. And that's knowing what the other person cares about and what's important to them.
That seems rather obvious, but we know, as is often said, common sense is not common practice, right? Why do you think that people are so bad at that pull style or have not spent time, building the muscles of that pull style, of seeking to bridge, of demonstrating curiosity, getting interested in what the other person's all about?
Well, sometimes I think people are curious, but there are certain things that get in our way that are either unconscious or habits or things we're not really aware of. And, one of my favorite things I studied in psychology and social psychology is a bias called the fundamental attribution error. And I love this because it explains so much about how humans interact at work. Right? Mm-hmm. And the fundamental attribution error basically tells us that how we try to understand somebody else's behavior is fundamentally flawed, which is funny because we're pretty confident about it, right?
Sure.
And what it kind of says is how I attribute my behavior is to my own circumstances, right? Like you might, if I'm having a bad day, maybe my kids were upset, it's snowing outside, my car's not working, and you and I go into a meeting and I'm, a little, let's say gruff with you. Not that I would ever do this. Of course, Cade, you've never experienced this firsthand, but let's just pretend, right?
I'll do my best.
Right? Imagine. So I'm a little gruff, maybe a little short, maybe a little, snippy. I'm thinking, hey, that's because of my circumstances, because I know my circumstances. Mm-hmm. But you're going to look at me and say, man, Stacey's personality is rough. She can be hard to be around. So the basic fundamental attribution error is I attribute my behavior to my circumstances, but somebody else's behavior, your behavior, Cade's behavior, that's because of his personality or his character, right? Like think about
one thing. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but one thing I was thinking of is, you and I spend so much time in front of a room with a bunch of people in the audience. You may have 30 people, 50 people. We've been in rooms of plus 100. And that one person who gets up and walks out when you're presenting, before they have ever hit the back door, and I may be telling a story in front of the room, but in my mind, my inner voice is saying the nastiest things about those people that are walking out. Right?
All right, kids, no one's going to want to hear you in person. They're going to be like, I can't get up.
Well, I apologize for that. But it is true, right? You just go there so quickly you're explaining this person's actions by their character. Oh, they're not interested in learning. They're old fashioned. They're becoming irrelevant. When in fact, the person may have just gotten like an emergency text from their kid.
Exactly.
They may have a direct report that just resigned. God knows what all could have happened. And yet we explain that behavior through character and give no credence to their circumstances, right?
Exactly. Not only are we meaning-making machines running around creating narratives and stories about actions, we're kind of self-involved in those narratives, right? We're still the hero of those narratives and think that people are doing things because of us. Like if I see someone and they walk out, I'm like, oh, is this what I'm saying not relevant? Do they not like what I'm saying? It becomes personal. It has absolutely nothing to do with me most of the time, right? And that gets in the way for us at work, right? If I'm working with someone and they show up and they haven't got something done, I think they're disorganized or lazy. And then over time, maybe I don't listen to them the same way. Maybe I start to listen to them like a person who's that way. And I just start trying to persuade them and influence them because it doesn't even seem worth it to try to understand where they're coming from.
You know what that makes me think about? I think fundamental attribution error has an equally ugly stepsister, which is confirmation bias. So once you begin to think these things about that person, then you filter out all evidence to the contrary. And all you're doing is looking for more data to prove that your assessment of their character was correct, right?
I mean, exactly. And think about how lacking in humility that can become over time, and not through intention, just sort of when we're on autopilot as human beings. I know you've done some work around kind of conflict resolution and communication and thinking about this. And I feel like, if that's how human beings are, like we know that, the fundamental attribution error, and we know about confirmation bias, thinking about what it takes to get out of that is what really helps people.
Exactly. So the person that I've learned the most from, of course, someone that you know well, is Mickey Connolly.
Yeah.
And the people that surround Mickey Connolly, like Jim Matroni and Robin Anselmi, all the folks at Conversant. I've learned probably more from them on influencing than any other keepers of a body of work. And one of the things that Mickey talks about is when you look at someone's attempt to communicate, does it create value or does it create waste? And I've always loved that distinction because, in the world of business, we're always talking about, does this create value or is it wasteful? And Mickey was like one of the first people that I ever heard who said, you can actually think about communication in that way. Is it valuable communication or is it wasteful communication? And so for me, that helps when I'm thinking about, all right, pushing versus pulling. Oftentimes pushing, we know, is wasteful communication.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of, again, showing up with our agenda, showing up with our biases, and we are just throwing up all over the person regarding what we want, what we think the ideal outcome would be. So that's one of the things that Mickey has taught me that I've found really valuable.
Well, isn't that interesting when you think about how tired people get after being in a lot of meetings that feel wasteful? How much of it is because people aren't effective at influencing, and people are either sharing information or more likely kind of trying to persuade people to buy into their agendas. And that waste takes up time and energy. So what are the things you've seen people do to either move out of being wasteful into more productive communications, right? Like, is there something more efficient?
Yeah. So one of the things that you said is, look, when we think about an influence style that's more pulling, it's this idea of getting curious. But getting curious can sound a little vague, right? And so how do we deconstruct that to instruct ourselves as to, all right, what do I get curious about? And again, one of the things that I learned from the folks at Conversant was this idea of purposes, concerns, and circumstances. And essentially they said, if you really want to get to know someone, get to know kind of the slice of the pie that they're occupying, those are the three things that you ought to seek to understand. So purposes is, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? So rather than showing up in a meeting with you, Stacey, and telling you everything on my mind and everything I'm trying to achieve. And by the way, we should also say that this is quite natural with the leaders that we work with because they are ambitious, they're achievement oriented, they're used to winning, right? And this has worked for them in some circumstances, perhaps, and now they're attempting to apply it in places where it doesn't work. Nonetheless, we get interested in what are they trying to achieve? And then, of course, circumstances. What's the set of facts that they have to acknowledge as they're doing their work? What are their constraints? And then lastly, concerns. What is it that they're worried about? So for me, when I'm seeking to influence, I'm going to start with questions. I want to inhabit this person's world so that I understand purposes, concerns, and circumstances. I should say when I'm seeking to do it well. I'll fall back into the old behavior often as well. But when I'm seeking to do it well, that's what I'm getting curious about.
Okay, so let's walk through an actual example. Let's say, I don't know, I need to influence Bob, the head of IT, to, help approve something I need, like new software. I'm just using an example, right? But I go to him and I'm like, hey, Bob, I need you to approve this new software because it's really going to help my clients. It's going to make it easier for me to get work done more efficiently. But Bob keeps saying no. Okay. What do I do?
Well, you can imagine, first of all, if Bob keeps saying no, and I am guilty of the fundamental attribution error, I'm saying to myself, man, Bob is a pain in the butt. Bob is stubborn. Bob is myopic. Bob is only worried about IT. Bob is in it for himself. So that's probably how I'm going into the conversation, which we already know isn't helpful.
And no one's ever said that about a guy in IT named Bob, ever, right?
God bless the Bobs of the world.
All right, sorry, Bob. Okay, so Bob's stubborn, right? Okay, well, that makes sense. I've heard people say things like that. I'm tracking. How do we do it differently?
We know there's an error in assuming all of those things about Bob to be true. So we want to get curious, right? So this is where you'd think purposes, concerns, and circumstances. So like step one, purposes. So if Bob's the head of IT and I'm attempting to get him to implement this software that's going to help out my function, like what would you imagine some of his purposes might be?
Okay, well, let's say his job is to keep the network stable and secure. So he's about stability and security and probably something about like cost reduction and doing things at scale or consistently. Yes. That's what I would guess, right? That's what he's about. All right.
And that in and of itself is just like an important step. And one of the things that I've heard Mickey say is that, most people have honorable purposes. Like they're actually showing up to get good work done. Bob's purpose is not to simply thwart me and my ambition. Bob's got a set of things to do that probably are really meaningful to him. So the things that you just cited, you could say in front of Bob, right? Those are honorable purposes. So bang on. So let's think about concerns. Like, what do you think Bob would be worried about with me and my software that I'm throwing in his lap? What could he possibly be worried about?
This great software. Okay, well, if those are his purposes, let's say he's afraid that whatever I want him to do, isn't consistent. It might be expensive. He might have then let everybody have to have different software. Maybe mine will crash the system or open a loophole or cause a problem that I can't see because I'm not an IT person, right?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, we can imagine what might some of the circumstances be that the head of IT for a large organization's facing.
I know this isn't ever happening, but let's guess, maybe they laid off 2 of his engineers, right? So his circumstances, he's understaffed, stressed out, and anxious about budget.
Yeah. And by the way, maybe there was a software system failure last year that's kind of burnished his reputation and he's still licking his wounds, right?
Totally. I can't imagine that happening, right?
We're hypothesizing, but we probably ought to get curious about that to know kind of like what Bob dealing with. So you start understanding those things, and then you can begin to see how you could navigate away from, say, that push mentality of, man, Bob is a stubborn butthead, and I'm going to have to go in and hit him over the head and get him to see the world the way that I see it. You move from that to more of a pull, which is, wow, Bob's really trying to get some good work done. He's had a couple of things that have caused him pain. And by the way, man, he is short-staffed, and I can see why he might be slow to say yes to this. Yeah.
I love that, because if you start to think of it like mapping, now we've figured out a way to at least talk to Bob, right? We have a way we can have a conversation with him that's it's more likely to be effective. Whether or not, right, if I go up to him and say, hey, Bob, I know you're short-staffed and you're probably worried about security. I really think I need this software. Is there a way we could structure a pilot or try it that doesn't make your life harder or add work to your plate, right?
Yeah. And what's
now
cool
he's going to listen.
Exactly. And what's cool about mapping these things and kind of putting this kind of thing into practice is maybe as you begin to understand Bob, rather than coming to him at the point that you've made the decision what software you want, you call Bob 6 months before when you're actually writing the ROI that you're sending out to vendors to say, hey, Bob, here's something, as you know, we've been facing tariffs. Our margins are suffering. We've got to find more efficiency in our sales processes. We think this can do it. This type of software can do it, but we don't want to add on to your concerns. How can you help us from the outset? I mean, that might be 2.0. But again, as you begin thinking about mapping this and understanding purposes, concerns, and circumstances, you can actually move the point of influence farther up in the process.
I love that because you're going to get better information and people get more bought in, right?
Yeah.
I love that. Well, let's talk about that. So we've talked about the fundamental, some of the biases, like the fundamental attribution error. I like purposes, circumstances, and concerns as a way of kind of understanding someone and sort of bringing an analytic mindset to influencing. But let's talk about what often makes people uncomfortable and is really hard to talk about work, which are power dynamics, right? Because if you're going to influence someone, you do have to think about power, right?
Yes.
And people can get really squeamish around that, even though it's the currency of how things get done at work, right?
Yes, exactly.
So, from my vantage point, there are often 3 types of power that you see people use at work. The first one is someone's kind of power that comes from their role, like I'm the boss, or I'm the team leader, or I'm the CEO, right? That sort of authority frame. The other one that I actually see even more often than that these days is expertise, the power that comes from being the expert, right? Well, I know the most, or this is best practice, or this is how we do it. When you hear people using words like that, what they're really trying to advance is the sense that they're an expert and that will give them power to persuade someone.
Have you ever seen people use their intelligence as a weapon? They weaponize their intelligence.
Yes. And in the world of, the world is cross-functional today. So then you kind of have people sandwiching on their own power and it can turn into a really wasteful meeting, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think the third type of power you see is relationship power. Who do I know at work? So for example, that's when people are name dropping. Like the CEO said they want this by tomorrow. Right? Why is that relevant? That's a way of demonstrating power to get someone to do something, right? And I think it's really important that we know which one Bob, in this case, or whoever you're trying to influence, relies on it, because you don't want to threaten their source of power. Like when you were giving that example, what I was thinking is, oh, you're really relating to Bob like an expert.
Yes. And one of the things I would say before we go to Bob and this idea of like, what's the source of power that Bob's using and how do we then think about how we approach him as a result? I do think that relationship power is an interesting one. To me, it's almost an oxymoron in that I don't know about you, but I've seen people who will invoke the CEO's name in order to wield some type of power. And I actually find that it robs them of power. It makes them look weaker. You ever seen that?
It does. I have. Because people don't like it,
No.
And they don't trust it.
It's also like a crutch. It's also like a crutch. Oh, so you don't have the authority or the ability to lead the group. You're simply referring on the good name of the CEO.
And don't you think sometimes people are going, did he say that? Are you sure?
Well, exactly. That's like that whole conversation is probably a different podcast, but I do find it interesting. But let's go back to the sources of power. So Bob, Bob is a smart dude. He's been in this role for a while, brainiac. So yeah, you would imagine that he's probably using kind of the expertise power. He knows the most here. And we've seen that before, right?
And what do you think would normally happen, like in a meeting, right? If someone walks into Bob and they want to persuade him to, use this new software, right? What do you see that people would normally do?
Yeah, well, they're just going to say, well, Bob, we've reviewed it. The software is safe. We've gone through the checklist. We're confident, Bob.
Right. And
Bob might be a little triggered.
Yeah. He doesn't respond well, right? Because now you've challenged his expertise, right? So what's he going to do? He's going to come back and find the smallest error or question, or if he can't prove it wrong, he's going to say, well, I need more time to think about it.
That's the death knell, isn't it?
it's your game over in the meeting, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So rather than kind of confronting that source of power, you got to think about how do you enhance Bob's sense of expertise power, right? How would you do that?
I mean, it's an interesting question. If I think about expertise as being a source of power and I want to enhance it, I'm going to actually approach him as an expert who can help me, right? And so I'm going to bring the problem to him, which is kind of what you were saying earlier. Do it early. Is I'm going to say, hey, Bob, here's my challenge, right? I need this software to finish a project for my client and I need your help. Can you help me think about, this, make sure it doesn't threaten our security or, works is consistent with what we've done, but I need you to help me solve the problem. It also helps me step back instead of, I guess, as I'm thinking about it, focus more on my problem versus what I think the solution is. Because I don't know about software. Bob is the expert, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great way to do it. I'll tell you another thing that's worked for me, particularly when I've worked with someone who has kind of the expertise power. And as you said, I see a lot of that too. Like, a lot of times when we're sitting with business unit presidents or heads of functions, there's a lot of role power, yes, but also a lot of expertise power. And you tell me, you coach me, maybe this is manipulative and I have to be really careful not to use it that way. But sometimes I'll say, one of the things that you've taught me is blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And I'm letting them see that they've influenced me, that they've taught me, that I am a student at the feet of the master, right? Mm-hmm. And I say it, if you don't mean it, it can be a little manipulative, right? You're being a little bit, you are working your charm a little bit too much. But if it's true, it actually does appeal to that source of expertise power, I think.
Well, another thing that taps into is people want a sense of fairness and reciprocity. And the research says that if someone believes they can't influence you, they won't let you influence them. Mm. And so what I love about that is, as you said, if you're doing it authentically, if you can go to someone and say, hey, there's this thing you've taught me, or here's a place where you've changed my mind, you're showing an openness, which is going to make them more open and comfortable to reciprocate.
Theoretically,
people
yes, right?
Inherently want that fairness, right? Mm-hmm. I know I've worked with people where I felt like I've sort of compromised or, done things or let them influence me. And when they don't reciprocate over time, it really wears you down, right?
Yeah.
So pointing it out.
That person's a taker, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
So with Bob, we're enhancing that source of power. We're enhancing his feeling of being the expert. And really what you're doing is you're enrolling him as opposed to kind of like coming at him.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Mm-hmm.
Stacey, what would you say, to someone listening and they're like, this sounds good, but man, this sounds like it would take a lot longer.
I've never heard anyone say that. Yeah, no, right. Well, I think it actually doesn't have to take very long to figure out someone's purposes, concerns, and circumstances. Mm-hmm. If you think about people you work with, you should be able to do it in about 2 to 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. And if you can't, and you need to go figure that out, you're not, if you don't know that, you're not going to have a successful influencing conversation and you're going to be wasting your time. You're going to be in those meetings where you're trying to persuade someone and it goes nowhere. And that's really a waste of time, right?
I would also say that if you've been working with someone for quite a while, even, someone that you wouldn't consider a friend, but just someone you've been working with and you can't name purposes, concerns, and circumstances, like you have some personal work to do, right? The quality of your listing is probably not where it ought to be. This person's speaking, they're giving you data all the time. Your response and the voice in your head and what you're going to say next is probably so loud that it's actually shutting down your ability to hear those people. So I think that's kind of a little bit of a self-check there.
Well, I'll put a slightly different spin on it. I had a client who was technically really proficient. Was a great person leading his function, very smart and very analytical, but he didn't always, we'll call it, pick up on social cues, right? And he wasn't very curious about other people. He wasn't mean. He just sort of lacked a curiosity. He wasn't really comfortable with people. And so one of the things I said to him is I was like, look, I want to use your analytical skills to think about the people on your team. And we made a chart. I was like, we're going to make a chart and we're going to put the name and we're going to say, what is this person about? What's their mandate? What are they trying to do? What are they worried about? And what are they dealing with? And he did it with every one of his peers on a leadership
And he was probably pretty good at it, right?
He was excellent at it, right? And so trying to get this guy to just
he's like, I'm a people person. I'm a people person. Who knew?
He's like, hey. And all of a sudden, he stopped showing up as flat, right? Because he had that information. So even though he couldn't, we couldn't just say to him, hey, be a little warmer, right? It wasn't going to happen, right? It was think more deeply about what matters to people. And if you're analytical, let's use it for the people you're a part of, right? The teams you're a part of, excuse me.
First of all, I love that. I love that you were taking what he knew to be a strength and you were directing that strength into an area that he felt a little bit uncomfortable, right? Like you're maximizing what you already knew he was good at. And the other thing, though, I think that is important there is he didn't do that in the meeting, right? He actually planned. He got ahead of the meetings.
Correct. And what never works is asking someone about their purposes, concerns, and circumstances as you're trying to influence them. Because not only
did you
is
go
it
to training?
Like, did you listen to a podcast? I mean, not only is it awkward and weird, then it does feel manipulative, right? Like if you ever had a boss who's trying to delegate something to you and they don't really know you and they're like, so Cade, tell me about what's important to you. And then they're like, here's a project that's completely unrelated to that, but I'm going to try to make it related to that. And you're just like, this is ridiculous. Yeah. You got to do it in advance.
Yeah. So Stacey, to the spirit of the podcast, you might try this. What might people try who recognize that they've got, some opportunities in the world of influencing? They want to get a little farther ahead. Like, what are some of the things that they could try in relation to some of the things we've chatted about?
Well, I'll say one and then you offer one. I would say the first thing that if you want to be a more effective leader that you can do is flip the fundamental attribution error. Meaning, in all of your interactions with people, take a beat and say, and remember that this person's going to perceive what causes my behavior as my personality. They don't know my circumstances and they're going to view me this way. And likewise, when you're interacting with somebody else, assume that their behavior is a function of their circumstances. Get curious. There's no downside to help trying to understand someone's circumstances. You're going to build empathy. You're going to gain information. I mean, you might be super helpful, but it's definitely not going to cause harm, right? And just flipping that, thinking differently about how you understand other people will pay dividends. So that's the first thing I'd say, try.
When I hear you say that, it reminds me of a word that we used to never use in the context of business that I think I've heard people use more now, and I love it. And that word's grace, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Exercising a little grace with people, understanding, man, we're all in this ringer together and they got crap going on just like you do. What must that crap be?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. What about you? What do you think people might try?
So, this idea, and some might think that it's pedantic, but thinking purposes, concerns, circumstances, and just like you advise with your client, thinking about mapping that out ahead of time, like getting really curious about it. It doesn't take that long. But I think going into a meeting with a surer sense of what I think to be true, and then using that meeting to understand how accurate your perceptions of purposes, concerns, and circumstances are. I remember once as a young consultant, I had the opportunity to go in and essentially pitch this big project that we wanted to do. And I showed up, and I used to have a client that said, show up and throw up. And I showed up and throwed up for about, 25 minutes of a 30-minute meeting of all the great things we could do. And in the last 5 minutes, the client said, we tried that one time. It was a huge failure.
I just wasted everybody's time.
I just wasted 25 of my 30 minutes. And so that idea of thinking ahead of time, what must this person be about, and getting in and thinking about what's the ratio of the questions I'm asking to the statements that I'm
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another thing that I think can help is to simply think, how much am I talking and how much am I listening?
Love that. Yes. Love that. Awesome.
Anything else?
I think it's great. That's it. That's what I got for now. So let's, maybe people go out and try it. That's what I think.
Excellent. See how it goes. Thanks very much, Stacey. Talk to you next time.
See you, Cade. Bye.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com or connect with us on social media.